for 20 minutes, Deputy Keaveney.
Thank you, Keaveney. 20 minutes. It's very generous of you. I'm grateful. Keaveney, the journal.ie placed a tweet yesterday saying that an anonymous Labour TD, of course, Keaveney, they're all anonymous until the last number of weeks because they belong to the anonymity party. And that anonymous Labour TD quipped that the budget was good, and that I, because as a consequence of that budget, would possibly consider returning to the anonymous party. Well, I can tell the Labour Party in the glorious anonymity that I remain to this day to be incredibly embarrassed with my association with them. And I am as embarrassed today as I was on the day I quit the ranks of the party. Because in December, in December 2012, I voted against budget measures that were nothing less than an attack on the lowest income people in this country and families that were struggling to put food on the table, to put food into the lunchbox of their children going to school, were attacked by this government in that budget. The context then is the same as the context today. The only reason I say that is that child poverty has increased significantly since this government entered into office in 2011. And what they have done, this government, since 2011, is equivalent to the robbing of a woman's umbrella in the midst of a heavy rain shower, and then trying to seek credit, a gratitude from the public about the sun coming out, and demanding gratitude from the drenched lady. I'm sorry for robbing your umbrella. Cuts after cuts, of which only 2 have been reversed. 40 cuts have been initiated by the Labour Party over the course of 2011 to 2015. But yet we have a situation here today which constitutes what I think is a perverse recollection of the situation over the course of that reference period, where the most draconian attacks took place against the poorest communities in this country. Those attacks have inflicted, in my view, Keaveney, enormous damage on the social fabric of the country, precisely at a time when the vulnerable people in this country needed a government that was going to protect a threshold of decency and defend them and their views within government. Keaveney, yesterday the government announced the restoration of the respite grant. And this is something that Fianna Fáil have called for over the course of the last number of years. But let not us have Fine Gael or their anonymous colleagues in government crow that this constitutes a restoration of the savage, regressive cuts that have been made in the area of social protection, because the vast majority of those cuts remain today. 40 cuts, and yet we have the anonymous party somersaulting around the plinth of the Dáil saying, we're back in business. You only have restored 2 of the 40 cuts. It's hardly worth the degree of celebration that's taken place on the plinth. Okay, here, look, the statistics don't lie. CSO figures show that at-risk of poverty rates in this country has risen 14.4% between the reference period 2009 to 2013. Consistent poverty from 4.2% to 8.2%, and deprivation has increased in the same reference period from 13% to 31%. Here, look, these figures are shocking. They're a shocking indictment of a government. But instead of feeling any shame and the cause of celebration about we're back in business because we have adjusted 2 of the 40 cuts, the Labour Party now claim to be Social Democrats and are boasting that this is a significant achievement in government. During the election in 2011, the Taoiseach and the now absent Deputy Gilmore both promised to prioritise the area of disability. And how hollow does that ring when we see, prior to this recess and the sitting of this Dáil this year, that people with profound disabilities would yet again camp outside the gates of Dáil Éireann to secure the protection of personal assistance. Consistently they've done from 2011, 12, 13 and 14, 15. Over and over again the government has attacked the capacity of people with disabilities. It has ensured that the participation of people with disabilities has been challenged. And I ask that the government would state here tonight why they have failed to advance the ratification of the EU Convention on the Rights of People with Disability. They've failed to advance any or one of the causes of human rights with respect to the equality of people with disability. The motto of this government has been yes to equality, but only for some. Orwell's Animal Farm comes into mind. All are equal, but some are more equal than others. Economic equality, or any equality that costs the Exchequer 1 penny, will be resisted. Ultimately, it will be refused and blocked, despite the promises that were made prior to the last general election by then Deputy Kenny and then Deputy Gilmore. The cause of people with disability over the course of the last 4 years has been a horrific cause, and there has been little respite in budget 2016 for people with disabilities. Laskin Corla. The €3 increase in pensions doesn't apply to those in receipt of invalidity pension, or the blind pension, or people with disabilities that see all of their services that have been eroded over the course of 11, 12 and 13. This is a group that are vulnerable to poverty and social exclusion. They don't have the equality. And I asked, can I ask you, why are you resisting the signing of the convention? Why aren't you resisting the convention?
Yeah.
Why are you paying lip service to people with disabilities?
Okay.
Lip service.
Just have Deputy
Lip service. The
Keaveney
budget
have
failed
the
to
floor.
restore the house. The budget failed to restore the housing adaptation grant that you cut. You cut people with disabilities. Comment here tonight. You personally cut.
Yeah. Could we all
instigated an attack on people with disabilities, and you smile here today at your own cuts. How dare you? Dare you smirk at people with disability? How dare you smirk at people with disability? You and your backbenchers smirk and giggle. You cut the adoption grant for people with disabilities. And the most you could do is offer people with disability a cold cup of coffee. A cold cup of coffee. You are the architect of the cut for people with disability. You smirk. How dare you?
Could we all come
The budget failed.
through the chair, please, and no more interruptions.
The budget failed in restoring the housing adoption grant that he cut. We have led in this area, and we've called in our pre-budget submission, and there has been no alternative, no evidence in any line of the proposed budget situation where we see even the mobility grant cut by the people across the chamber. The mobility grant, and yet they launched an announcement last week about the integration of people into the employment market without any cognizance about the capacity of somebody to get to work. So this is a government that has singled out the most vulnerable people in society, people with disabilities. They were overlooked in Budget 2016. Much of the infrastructure that was required, Laskin Corla, for people with disabilities, to lead an independent, equal life, to be brought from the periphery to the centre, it was dismantled by this government. The adoption grant for people with disabilities, to get into a shower, it's cut by you. You did it. That's your legacy. Laskin Corla, the commitment from this government in the area of mental health is questionable. It's questionable to say the least, because the absence of any mention in the last 48 hours, any mention on the issue of mental health in the budget. Not one mention, and it's been quite telling. Not one mention of disability, and not one mention of mental health. And it really goes as far to tell us what your priorities are and your type of recovery, leaving people behind. Because your instinct for self-preservation kicks in at the cost of mental health and the most vulnerable people in society. The health allocation yesterday made no announcement on disability or mental health. Now, that's a sharp contrast to the commitments you made prior to 2011. Sharp contrast. In terms of mental health, we have a real cause of concern because every single year since 2011 in Laskincorla, the government has broken its commitment to deliver on a commitment for ring-fence funding of €35 million for the development of a community mental health service, the virtual ward in the community. Hasn't happened. Laskincorla, last year 500 people died dead by suicide in this country. This government cut mental health consistently. My own home county, an underspend of €6 million in mental health. These people smirk at me for raising the cause of disability in mental health. How dare you? How dare you? You attacked the most vulnerable. The evidence speaks for itself. In every single budget from 2011, 12, 13, 14, and this year, you cut the budget, underspent, 2,500 staff you failed to recruit in order to ensure that the transition from acute mental health into the community setting would happen. This crisis that exists out there is of your making. There isn't one mention, not one mention in the documentation that has been submitted over the last 48 hours on Budget 2016 about the issue of mental health. That is an indictment on this government. Yesterday's press conference, the resultant exchange between Minister Varadkar, Junior Minister Lynch, and Sarah Burke, I want to read into the record. Sarah Burke says, I realise, I quote, I realise you were kicking to touch a lot of service plan details, and somebody must have added the sums. For example, the €35 million that has been sought year after year, Minister Lynch, has it been gained this year? Minister Varadkar, the man of the year, intervenes and says, I don't want to give that information yet because it hasn't been quite decided. The dynamic of the figure, well, we're still working on it. Then Minister Lynch interjects to say, but it's not that it's not done. It is done. It's very obviously done. It's just that we haven't done it yet. Minister Varadkar says, well, it's within the range. And Sarah Burke says, what range? We can have the range here now this evening, Minister, can't we? He said, well, no, we can't, because I want to make sure we get the range right. Sarah Burke, quite frankly, says, will the additional €35 million that wasn't spent in 11, 12, 13 and 14 of current expenditure be spent in mental health in 2016? And of course, Minister Keaveney jumps in to say yes. The commitment in relation to mental health for €35 million, it's there, it's a commitment. Well, this was the end of an exchange. Minister Lynch's commitment in her final comment is a little source of comfort to me because she failed to protect in 11, 12, 13 and 14 the €35 million. The greatest public health crisis of our generation. More people die dead by suicide in this country than die on our road. And Minister Lynch could not give a straight answer. I mean, to be fair, to credit to the man of the year, he made a greater attempt in being transparent with the status of that €35 million. See, you can smirk at me, you might think it's funny. See, Minister, the progress in filling these posts and the lack of transparency around the application of those posts points directly at the failure of political will in the area of disability and mental health. And a recent response to a parliamentary question that I proposed in this area demonstrates how poor the practice and delivery of service that exists in child and adolescent mental health units. One issue of mental health that overlaps with more than a significant core group in society has emerged under this government has been your failure to deliver mental health care for people who are homeless. It's appalling. The respite of people who die on our streets. And we'll all remember Jonathan Corrie, but do we know any of the 6 names that have died in the meantime? You have successfully managed to normalise how poor things are out there because you believe in austerity. And mental health, homelessness, They have a very complex relationship in the midst of our housing crisis. And we have seen no budgetary provision with respect to mental health, respite, with respect to what's happening on our streets. I walked from this chamber today to Hibernia, the archway. I walked over 4 homeless people who I've no doubt are very eager. They're probably not voters and don't matter, of course, because this is a government run by focus groups. As you could see in yesterday's Examiner, the front page, a budget for the voter. Obviously, mental health and homelessness is, it's a very complex, dynamic relationship that seems to have just been forgotten by this government, because yesterday's announcement was appalling. Appalling to think that not one provision for homelessness, not one provision for mental health, no provisions for disabilities. That's going to be your legacy. So alongside that failure, there was no provision for palliative care for a person, a citizen, who knows that they're going to die. Where would they go in their last moments in this country? What street would they choose to die in? And this is a question, in truth, it bothers me. And on the other hand, it's bothering all of the homeless agencies, but there was no provision at all for respite, palliative care for homeless people in the budget yesterday. And I'll mention homelessness and housing and homelessness. It's a great social challenge for this country. The Labour Party sat at Cabinet for 4 years with the housing portfolio, and you simply watched this happen day by day, painful day. It has been evident since 2012, this crisis. It was brewing up. A Minister of State then, with responsibility for housing, John O'Sullivan, did nothing until that man came in on the issue of housing. The government only finally seemed to notice that the problem existed in our communities and in our high streets when we stepped over a dead man walking into our work. His name was Mr. Corrie, 100 metres down the road. And Mr. Minister Kelly took it upon himself to solve it. At first, it seemed that something might be done. There were significant announcements, and we were told that Minister Kelly was kicking down the doors and he was opening up the doors, and we were getting a resolution, and there wasn't going to be a firing pill held back on this situation. The dynamic that was going to emerge around this situation was going to be unequalled. And of course, Minister Kelly, he's not alone in his failure to confront this. His party leader, Taoiseach, Minister for Social Protection, she has played her own part. Despite being advised to do so by organisations such as Threshold, Focus, and even Father Peter McPherry, she stubbornly refused to increase the limits on rent supplement. The consequence of that, Lasconcola, in my own hometown, families sleeping in sheds, turf sheds. That's the result of this government policy. I apologise if I've broken protocol, Lasconcola. It's critically important that we are transparent and close to the truth. The homeless crisis in this country is not a Dublin-centric crisis. It prevails across rural Ireland, and it's impacting on families. Children living in turf sheds for their 9th week this week. That's the legacy of this government. 9 weeks sleeping in a turf shed. Of course, now the Simon community tell us we're faced with a situation where 93% of properties for rent are outside of the rent supplement cap. And on the day that that was checked, not one property was available to rent in 5 of the largest cities in this country. So the crisis, it's quite evident in Dublin. It's evident in my own home constituency in Galway East, where this government have abandoned a family to a turf shed. 9 weeks homeless. That's what's happening in this country. And tonight, that couple will sleep in a shed, and their children will sleep on a floor adjacent to them. And they will sleep there for months. They will sleep there for months as there are boarded up houses, voids, local authorities starved of the resources to help the most vulnerable. So this budget is a final confirmation that you have delivered exactly the fabric of what you are, a right-wing government. And it's been long overdue that that was said to you. The damage that you have done to society with regressive budgets year after year, independently validated as regressive.
Thank you, Deputy.
I appreciate, Minister, that the truth hurts, and that's why you try and disrupt the truth. Go and listen to the people outside. Go and listen to the homeless people, if you would bother, because you're obviously not listening to their representatives. You've ignored them, like you've ignored people with disabilities. The most they're worth is a cold cup of coffee on a September morning by the Prime Minister of this country.
Good morning. Now the next speaking